This is Metatherapy, where we talk about therapy itself. Not advice, not diagnosis, just understanding the process so you can use it better. Each episode of Metatherapy is psychoeducation, not therapy. If something resonates, it's meant to be language you can bring back into your own work. Yesterday on Meditation Monday, we practiced something called open monitoring, the capacity to watch our own mind without getting swept into it, to notice you're having a thought instead of just being inside it. And if you tried that, even for 5 minutes, you may have noticed how genuinely hard it is. Not because you lack discipline, not because you have attention deficit, but because there's an entire industry whose singular job is to make that kind of watching impossible. Today, we're going to talk about that industry. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the neuroscience and behavioral psychology of what's actually happening when you pick up your phone and don't know why. Here's what I want to be clear about from the start. I'm not going to tell you that your phone is bad or that social media is rotting your brain or that you should do a digital detox. That framing is moralistic and it's also just not accurate. What I am going to tell you is that the experiment of feeling distracted and the experience of scrolling without choosing, of putting your phone down and picking it back up 90 seconds later, that is not a character flaw. That is an engineering outcome. And once you understand the engineering, you have a fighting chance of opting out of it. 3 things we're going to cover today: the behavioral science of how distraction is manufactured, what that does to your cognitive and emotional capacity, and what the research says actually works, and what's just friction theater. So let's start with the mechanism. In the 1950s, a behaviorist named B.F. Skinner ran an experiment that has since become one of the most replicated findings in all of psychology. He put rats in a box with a lever. In some conditions, pressing the lever always produced a food pellet. In others, it produced a pellet randomly. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, unpredictably. The rats in the second condition pressed the lever compulsively, far more than the rats who were guaranteed a reward every time. Because anticipation, the not knowing, is more neurologically compelling than certainty. Skinner called this this variable reward schedule, and your phone is a Skinner box. The pull to refresh gesture, infinite scroll, the unread badge result, and count, these are not neutral design choices. Former Google design ethicist Tristan Harris has described these as deliberately implemented persuasive technology, features engineered to exploit the dopamine anticipation loop. The unpredictability is the point. You don't know if the next scroll will have something worth seeing. That uncertainty creates a compulsion loop. Researchers describe it as ludic loops, cycles of engagement that persist without delivering satisfaction. Now, here's where the popular framing gets something wrong. You've probably heard that social media gives you a dopamine hit, and that checking your phone is addictive because of dopamine. That framing is partly right, but mostly misleading. First of all, dopamine isn't even a pleasure chemical. It's an anticipation chemical. Its primary function is to drive you toward a potential reward, not to reward you when you get there. The pleasure, if it does come, is a different system entirely. What this means practically, you keep checking not because it feels good, but because your brain is perpetually in the state of something might be there, something might be there, something might be there. The reward is always about to arrive, and it never quite does. So you check again. Research by Terrell and colleagues found that excessive social media use activates the same brain regions involved in behavioral addictions, particularly in the midbrain limbic dopamine system during the early stages of heavy use. Separate research from neuroscience shows that the use becomes more problematic over time. The mechanism shifts. Early overuse is driven by positive reinforcement seeking. Later stage compulsive use is maintained by negative reinforcement, using the phone to escape anxiety or emotional discomfort, tied to prefrontal limbic circuit changes. 2 different mechanisms, same behavior. And then there's the presence effect, which is, to me, the most clinically interesting finding in all of the literature. A study published in the journal of the Association for Consumer Research found that the mere presence of a smartphone on a desk, just the phone sitting there, face down, turned off, not ringing, measurably reduced available cognitive capacity in participating performing tasks. The research call it brain drain. The phone doesn't need to be used to tax you because part of your brain is continuously managing the pull of it, monitoring whether to check, deciding not to, then redeciding. That self regulation effort, click, 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 draws on the same attentional resources you need for everything else. Your phone reduces your cognitive capacity when it's off and face down on your desk, not because you're weak, but because that's what it was built to do. So, bottom line, the architecture matters, and we'll come back to that. So let's talk about what sustained digital distraction actually does, not to your screen time numbers, but to your capacity as a human being. Because this is where I think the conversation gets clinically important. The first cost is attentional depth. There's a difference between attention that skims and attention that penetrates. Deep work, meaningful conversation, emotional presence with another person, these all require the capacity to stay with something long enough for it to reveal itself. Variable reward environments train the opposite, rapid surface scanning, and that training transfers. Research on heavy media multitaskers, people who frequently use multiple screens or apps simultaneously, found reduced gray matter volume in the anterior cingulate cortex, region associated with a higher order cognitive control and sustained attention. This is structural, not just functional. The research also shows that heavy multitaskers recruit more neural resources from top down attention networks when distractions are present. They're working harder to do the same focusing task as lighter users. The second cost is emotional regulation capacity, and this one is undertaught. I'm going to say it again. The second cost is emotional regulation capacity. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain here responsible for weighing consequences, inhibiting impulse, holding complexity, is also the part that gets taxed by constant self-regulation around device use. Every time you override the urge to check your phone, you're drawing on the same reservoir you need to not snap at your partner, to stay curious in a hard conversation, to tolerate uncertainty without reaching for certainty. Ego depletion is real, and we're burning it on pull to refresh. The third cost, and this is the one that brought this topic to Therapy Tech Tuesday, is meta awareness, the capacity we practiced yesterday. Open monitoring, the watching mind, the observer position, all of that depends on having a quiet enough cognitive background to actually notice your own internal states. Digital distraction doesn't just consume attention. It raises the noise floor. It makes it harder to hear yourself think. And in therapy, that cost is enormous. Insight requires signal, distraction is noise, and you cannot out insight a noisy system. Okay, so we know what's happening and why. The question is, what do we do about it? I want to distinguish between three categories here: architectural interventions, behavioral scaffolding, and awareness based approaches, because they work differently and the research support for each is a little different. So, architectural interventions. These are changes to the physical or digital environment that reduce friction during and toward the distraction and increase friction away from it. They work because they don't rely on willpower in the moment. Phone out of the room during focus work, not on silent, face down, out of the room. The research on the presence effect makes this non negotiable if deep focus is the goal. This is the highest evidence intervention in the literature. Notification architecture, not just turning them off, but auditing which notifications actually correspond to things that require immediate attention versus those things that can wait. Most people find the answer is almost none of them require immediacy. Placement. Burying social media apps in folders, removing them from the home screen, requiring 2 or 3 taps to access them. Small friction, measurable effect. Not because you're blocking yourself, but because you're creating a moment of choice where the habit was running on zero choice autopilot. Research on persuasive design shows that users identify the specific features, infinite scroll, notification batching, autoplay, as extending their usage beyond intent. Architectural changes that interrupt these features have the most evidence behind them. Apps that create friction are essentially restoring the moment of choice the original design removed. Behavioral scaffolding, the app segment. Here's where Freedom, Opal, and the iOS screen time come in. And I want to be honest about what they are and aren't. These apps work primarily through one mechanism, friction. They make checking harder. Freedom and Opal let the schedule blocks where apps are inaccessible. iOS screen time gives you data and optional limits with a passcode. They work for some people some of the time, but there's an important caveat. My honest take is use them for specific time bounded goals, focused work sessions, sleep hygiene windows, not as a general solution to a structural problem. They're training wheels, not a rebuilt nervous system. And then we have awareness based approaches. This is where Monday's practice comes back in. The most durable change to digital distractions and patterns is in the clinical literature comes from increasing metacognitive awareness, the capacity to notice you're about to check your phone before you've already checked it. Self control at that point, earlier, the noticing that precedes the impulse execution. That gap, the space between the pull and the action, is exactly what open monitoring meditation trains, not as a silver bullet, but as a capacity that, once developed like a muscle, starts to apply across contexts. You're not fighting the pull, you're moving upstream of it. Studies on mindfulness based interventions and technology use show that the mechanism itself isn't relaxation or stress reduction, it's decentering. The ability to observe a craving or impulse from a slight distance rather than from inside it. This is the same mechanism that makes mindfulness effective for addiction, for emotional dysregulation, for impulsive behavior broadly. The implication, the meditation practice and the digital hygiene practice aren't two separate things. They're the same intervention working at different levels. So here's the framework I use clinically and that I'd offer to you. Environment first, architecture before willpower, always. Remove the phone from the room, change the default. Scaffolding second. Use a tool if it helps you hold a boundary during a transition period while you're rebuilding the habit. But don't mistake the scaffold for the building. And then finally, awareness third. And this is the long game, the metacognitive capacity to notice the pull without following it. That's what you were practicing yesterday. And the more you practice it, the more it generalizes. I want to end with something that I think matters for clinicians and clients who are really invested in the work with their therapists, because a lot of you watching are therapists, social workers, people in therapy, people who collaborate with mental health professionals. Therapeutic presence, real presence, the kind that makes a session feel different from a conversation, requires exactly the cognitive conditions digital distraction degrades. The capacity to hold multiple registers simultaneously, what the client is saying, what the therapist is saying, what they're not saying, what's happening in your body during the session, what's shifting in the room. That's a high bandwidth internal state. And it runs on the same attentional substrate that variable reward environments are designed to fragment. So when a client says, or a therapist says, I feel like you're really here with me, that experience is in part the product of an attentional system that hasn't been pre-taxed by a morning of compulsive scrolling. That's not mystical. That's neuroscience. The meta awareness you built in Monday's practice and the architecture you put around your device use, they're the same project, protecting the quality of your inner signal so that when the work requires it, the capacity is there. My name is Dominic Adori, and this has been Tuesday Technology on Metatherapy. I'll see you next week.